Hey, it's Sarah Spain with ESPN and a minority owner of the Chicago Red Stars, here with Dr. Nicole LaVoi, director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport. And we're here on behalf of the Angel City Equity House and Gatorade to talk about women coaches and coaching the female athlete. And Nicole, I'm excited to do some myth busting about both of those things, to talk about some best practices, figure out how to reduce things like abuse and poor coaching technique, and hopefully change some of the philosophy around what makes a good coach, particularly for girls and for women. And I'm excited to have you here today because you are the expert on all things girls and women in sport, and you've done a ton of research around all of this. And I think the only place to start would have to be at the youth level and identifying first why it is that so many girls drop out of sport at a young age and how that eventually leads to what they are willing to accept and deal with throughout their career. So let's start way back. Why are girls dropping out of sports more than boys?
We know there's a lot of reasons why girls drop out of sport. First of all, it's fun to have this conversation with you around girls and women in sport. And thank you for that nice introduction. But what we know about girls in sport, why they drop out, we could talk 2 hours about that. But there's a lot of barriers in terms of lack of opportunity, how the system is created around gender bias and sexism and misogyny. Media portrayals of what it means to be a female athlete is in, opposition to what it means to be feminine and girly, to parent permissions, to girls themselves. Just, it's not fun. And a lot of coaches are constructing the environment in a way that it's win at all costs. And that is just driving many girls away from sport.
Yeah, I think the resources and expectations for what it means to be a girl in sport, what that could lead to as a woman and a professional, all of those things kind of come together to cause girls to drop out. Now, the ones that do stick around sometimes are dealing with a whole lot of accepting poor coaching, uninvolved coaching, abusive coaching. Why do you think soccer in particular and youth soccer is so ripe for abuse and mishandling of young girls?
Unfortunately, and this is true, not just in soccer, but soccer might be an exemplar, is that most coaches in every sport at every level, especially in soccer, are usually white men with British accents. And those are perceived to be the norm. And what we know about that, and now this is not all, and just generalizing, but the status quo of coaching is to teach girls and children in general, but there's a gender component here, to be conformant and obedient. Do what I say. Don't question me. I'm the boss. And girls learn to conform to that position of power and that style of leadership so that as they move up the levels, they're being taught to get playing time, to make the team, to get to the next level, to make the national team, to get a scholarship. They're learning, I just do what I'm told and I remain silent. And that creates this culture of abuse that's rife in soccer and many other sports.
Right. And we know that that's certainly possible to happen with the power dynamics in coaching at the boy and men level as well. But I think when you combine it with societal expectations of girls and sort of the internalized belief system around what girls are supposed to be when it comes to talking out or confronting power, any of those things, that's why it's more likely for those things to combine and create a system where they feel like they shouldn't speak out at all. In particular, too, when you add in the idea that they should just be grateful that anyone wants to coach them, right? There's so many of these media tropes where the punishment for a male coach is like, you have to go coach the girls, right? Yeah. So you're internalizing all of these things that we're not that valuable to start with. Then there's a person who's willing to give us their time and effort. And so it's not our place to speak up. And when you do that at the youth level, Nicole, I wonder what that sets up in terms of players accepting behavior and treatment like that when they become college, high school, professional.
Yeah, it follows them throughout the levels because that's what they're used to. That's the norm. That's what they've accepted as needing to compete and move and succeed. And so they're just uncritically accept that that's just how it is. And what I really find dangerous about that is that we don't equip young women to recognize this and to push back and use our voices and to say, hey, this is not right. at all levels of abuse, physical, mental, social, emotional, sexual abuse, it just becomes normalized. And that troubles me greatly because sports should be one of the contexts that counteracts all these societal messages about women in power. And in fact, it just reinforces this idea that men are in charge and women are the subordinate. And that is why I do what I do.
Yeah, and it's not unique only to male coaches. There are certainly instances of female coaches who abuse the power dynamic as well. But I think part of it is the expectation that we have that what we've always imagined as this sort of ideal coach is something that more and more we're understanding is not only ineffective at best, but can be abusive and toxic at worst. So let's talk about kind of changing the philosophy around coaching. When I think of the stereotypical coach that we often have seen more in the past, a little bit less so now, as the ideal, they're white, they're male, they're angry, they're tough. And by the end of the movie or the TV show, you learn that all along they just wanted the best for you and all that toughness came from a great place. Unfortunately, in real life, that's not always the case. And we often especially find in girls and young women and even professional women, that's not the most effective coaching style. How do we change our ideas around that?
Well, one is the media and the visualizations of coaches that we commonly see. You're right. If you think of any of your favorite sport movies, first of all, the top 5 that probably pop in your head had to be male athletes with a male coach. And so that becomes the norm of what it means to coach, how they behave, and who is the coach. So those ideas become, well, that's just common sense. And so what we need to do is start portraying different kinds of coaches at all levels, from youth all the way to high performance, because that normalizes that women do coach and are successful. And also the second piece of that is, what does it look like to coach, of what we know from coaching science, sports psychology, and child development is not what you see in the movies and on TV. But those kinds of coaches that are athlete-centered, power with, create a positive climate, that are considerate about the full athlete, that's not a good storyline. So we don't tell those stories, but we need that.
Right. It's more nuanced to talk about a coach that is interactive and works with players and brings out the full balance of who they are. I'm hoping Ted Lasso gives us a little bit more of those conversations as opposed to a lot of the previous representations. I'm thinking right now about all the movies I've seen, and I was trying to think of a single female coach in most of the main sports movies we've seen and really struggling. And then thinking about even in women's sports movies, something like Bend It Like Beckham, the main character is in love with her coach, who's a man, right? That dynamic is constantly being portrayed to us as something we should be looking for or appreciating or finding romantic, instead of yet again setting us up to understand and accept a abuse of power and a power dynamic that would be extremely toxic to a team.
Hey, if you're interested in making movies that portray women as competent, badass coaches, give us a call.
Right. I mean, we got to call, Natalie Portman. We got to call Gina Davis. She's got a whole company devoted to that. We got to call Reese Witherspoon, who's making all these female-driven things. So let's get him on the line, Nicole. I know somebody.
I might know somebody who knows somebody. So
okay, good.
Let's cover our bases.
How do we train coaches to see things differently? Are there certifications or programs that exist that we should be demanding? Because unfortunately, there are even some things like safe sport that are supposed to be in place and have been rife with their own issues. So have we found a system or a certification that we can trust that coaches should be using?
Unfortunately, there's no worldwide standard of this. It's country dependent. Here in the U.S., for example, we don't have a centralized sport federation that mandates a certain level or quality of coach education. Other countries like Canada or Australia or the UK, they're a little bit better, but we have a lot of work to do in this. And you mentioned the International Safe Sport, which is supposed to be the international governing body. They're very problematic because they're underfunded and under-resourced, because the problem of abuse is so widespread. So even when we try to put those safeguards in place, they're still not working.
I think one of the things that comes up a lot in conversations around women's sport in a different way than men's is, how do we identify toughness in coaching, motivation in coaching in sports, which we know requires pushing yourself to the limit, being able to fail and come back and succeed again, being able to take criticism and learn from it and get better. How do we talk about that while understanding where the line is between toughness and making people better and abuse?
This is a really slippery slope conversation, but if we rely on the science, what we know works from sports psychology and coaching science, it's pretty clear. And I'm not going to get into the details of that because we don't have time. However, what we need to do is also realize that toughness is layered in gender bias. So if a male coach is coaching, acting angry, tough, and in charge, if a female coach does that, she's automatically thought of as aggressive, mean, a bully, and abusive. And so we have to unpack that as well. And that gets really nuanced really quickly.
So I want to get to that in a second, but let's go back to what you said about the research. And we're not doctors here other than you. So maybe, dumb it down for us. But what does the research tell us about best practices and how to find that line between toughness and abuse?
Okay. So I like the frameworks that's called the 3 C's. And this is from a theory called self-determination theory. We all have 3 essential human needs, and coaches can create a climate where these 3 needs are met. We want to feel cared about, we want to develop our competence, and we want to feel a sense of choice and control, which is autonomy. So when coaches create those climates, intrinsic motivation is more likely to occur, which means athletes are having fun, they're stimulated, they're learning, they're growing, and they want to play soccer because it's fun. And isn't that what sport is supposed to be about? It's supposed to be fun, even at the highest level. And I think a lot of times we forget that. Then you can.
I love that because it's so true. First of all, when you look at championship teams, there's a vibe around them all season long of this incredible chemistry, the fun they have with each other, the sport they have with each other and with their coach or manager. And to your point, it is so clear when you see a coach whose players respect them and don't want to let them down instead of fear them.
Yeah.
Right? There is this old saying of if they don't fear me, they won't hear me. And most people are so moved on from that to understand that there has to be a mutual level of respect in order to want to do your best for them and for the other people on your team. I love the 3 C's. That's great. Okay, let's get back to what you mentioned about the sort of myths about female coaches versus male coaches, because the problem is we can't underestimate the opportunity and potential for a female coach to also be abusive. But what you're saying is that oftentimes women coaches who are trying to apply the same techniques that are approved and proven to work are immediately labeled before their male counterparts as being a problem.
That's correct. And that is classic symptom of gender bias, that women coaches at every level, even at the highest level of women's soccer, face every single day. And we need to just educate coaches, athletes, parents, administrators, sports stakeholders that we're all in the system of gender bias, and it affects women coaches disproportionately than it does men. And nobody is condoning abuse. But we also need to tease out that fact that abuse sometimes is because of athletes and stakeholders' unconscious gender bias around the behaviors of women coaches. And it's a sad fact.
When we talk about it in terms of sports, sometimes I think people find it more difficult to grasp. But when we zoom out and recognize that this is actually just a gender bias in every aspect of society, I think it's easier to understand. The idea that there are actual studies that say that the more powerful, more rich, more important, and more successful women become, the less liked they are. And the reverse is true for men. So when you consider a coach as a position of power and success and authority, you can understand how a man would continue to be more and more respected and liked as a result of that power. And inherently, due to constant learning from society, due to no fault of our own, we are conditioned to dislike that woman the higher she gets and the more power she attains. Once we recognize that at every single part of society, we're able to it's easier for us to see it at sports and understand that we're bringing those feelings to the space, as opposed to trying to, I think it's harder when you try to explain it to people using just a sport context, because there are so many nuances and specifics between different coaches and coaching levels.
Yeah. And I think one thing, I do want to bring up, as you mentioned, like the more visible, lucrative, and powerful the woman gets, she's less liked. The paradox of that is the more lucrative, visible, and powerful the position becomes, you see less women. So the women that actually make it to that highest level are really under a double-edged sword of having to be perceived as competent, but also likable. And men don't have to negotiate that.
Sounds like the presidency. Yeah. But also worth noting, to your point, we saw that in particular after Title IX. And as programs began to make money, men began becoming the coaches because there was more funding for them. There was a higher pay. There was more value in the coaching position. And the percentage of female coaches, particularly across something like college basketball, started to dwindle as men started to take the jobs that women used to hold when they were paid less and had less prestige. So that's really true. So it's tough to have the conversation about toughness versus abuse. It's also tough to have conversations about our bodies as our jobs when we're athletes. There is so much societal expectation for women in terms of their aesthetic beauty and the expected standard of their body as athletes that completely ignores the realities of gender and completely ignores the fact that your aesthetic beauty and what your body looks like isn't always a predictor of your body's performance and your ability. So how do we have conversations with athletes and coaches about bodies, whether that's weight gain that is affecting performance or whether that's weight loss and loss of period or things like that that are affecting performance, without running into the very real possibility of conflict or toxicity?
Well, let me just say that this is a really awesome topic to talk about because right now, as we speak, the Tucker Center, in conjunction with Nike and some other partners, are developing a tool called Coaching Her. And there's a piece of that talks about body image, body positivity, and how do we upskill coaches to create the right climate where we talk about bodies in healthy ways, where we eliminate body talk, we eliminate talk about body appearance, we talk about functionality and health and wellness. And then we also upskill the athletes to listen to their bodies and be able to empower athletes to talk about their bodies when their bodies are fatigued and tired or strained or injured, and that we empower that instead of having power over athletes to silence them and just be like, we need you to play, get in the game, and shut up and do it.
There's a lot that coaches need to know about, and I think we really underestimate the importance a coach can have in the language that they use and the way they talk to their athletes. And that's everything from body image to feelings of adequacy and belonging, and also mental health. This is another really interesting one. How do we have honest conversations about the realities and stressors and disappointments and conflicts that arise in sport while also being respectful of actual mental health, right? Players are going to be disappointed if they're not playing enough. Players are going to be disappointed if there's a lot of pressure or stress on them. How do we understand when that's authentic and natural and is something to push through, and when it's something that's maybe unnatural or a player is being asked outside of expectation to deal with things?
I'm a big fan of centralizing the voices of women, and elite athletes, high performance athletes know their bodies. They know their state of mind. And what happens when we silence and ignore women when they're talking about their bodies, whether it's menstruation, injury, mental health, physical strain, we don't listen. So when we listen and we empower women to talk about their mental health, and a lot of athletes are doing that now, we're normalizing that this is how it should be. If we want our athletes to perform their best on command, then they are the ones that know their bodies and minds the best.
Right.
So let's build in support mechanisms to help them do that rather than just say, suck it up, be tough, and get on the field. That just doesn't work anymore. And we have enough knowledge of sports science now to learn how to help female athletes do that effectively.
I think also in the past, we've relied a lot on baseline performance when it comes to physical ability. We understand when an athlete is running slower, jumping higher, running faster, doing all those things, and we haven't done the same with mental health. So instead of making it one big thing: mental wellness, mental health, mental performance, separating them and finding baselines for each, right? If you're not feeling your best, are you below the baseline after which we need to start paying attention? Or are you just having an off day? And those kind of conversations of understanding what the baseline is for everything from performance, which is how do you fare in the clutch when the pressure is highest, to actual mental health. How are you doing? Are you depressed? Are you suffering anxiety beyond the norm? We need to know each individual person well enough to be able to have them gauge that and then talk about it, which I don't think we do in the same way we do with our physical health. But we're getting better for sure.
And I do think there's a mental toughness component of like sport performance that we didn't know about in sports psychology. And then there's the clinical side of, crippling anxiety, depression, mental health, trauma-based anxieties. And that's a clinical. So sometimes we lump them into one, and sometimes we need to tease them apart.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we change perception? Let's get into some taking action. You talk about the ideas we have around women coaches. How do we change the perception of them, how they're received, the idea of their competency, and then how do we create a pipeline for more of them to get involved? What's holding them back?
First of all, we need to see women coaches more in the media, being competent, being visible, being powerful, being badass women. We need to see that and normalize that. We just rarely see women. I was really surprised that 40% of the head coaches of World Cup teams are women.
Yeah.
Knowing soccer is horrible in terms of the percentage of women coaches, I was shocked. So that's in and of itself a great storytelling mechanism, like at the highest level, look at all these women. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is that the men in power need to give women opportunities to enter those positions and use their power to leverage that. So those are two key ones, and I can talk about a few more if you want me to.
Well, I think you have to think about resources that are required for women who are moms or caretakers, especially in jobs where they travel. High school, college, professional. If you're on the road, what are the resources you have for your children if you're bringing them or if they're staying home? Things like that we just don't really have a true understanding of some of those necessities that are required for women to see a pipeline that they want to keep following up, as opposed to stopping before they get to the highest levels.
Yeah, and I think that relies at the policy level and an organizational structure that supports coaching mothers. And I always say what's good for women is good for men. A lot of coaches are fathers, and they don't get the support they need. So I just feel like, oh, well, we're just talking about the mothers, but it's stipend for traveling with your child. Maybe you bring your partner so they can take care of the kid, daycare, support for things around parent coaches that are great for mothers, because unfortunately, most of the childcare labor still falls on the shoulders of women. So if you're a coaching mom, it's a lot more difficult for you than a coaching father. But what's good for the moms is good for the dads. And we have a long way to go for that to happen.
You've mentioned there are 40% female coaches in the World Cup, but there are still plenty of issues across the board from so many countries entering this tournament, whether that's their bonuses for the World Cup being withheld from their federations, whether that's the Spanish team that's actively protesting, many of their top players sitting out the World Cup because of complaints that have gone unlistened to by their federation. What have we learned from some examples of teams or leagues that have managed to be disruptive enough to make a change, even when the powers that be at the highest levels don't seem particularly invested?
Well, I think our own World Cup women's national team here in the U.S. was a real good exemplar of not accepting the status quo, fighting back, demanding what they deserve, and holding out until at least they got something that was closer. They didn't get everything they deserved, but they got something. And when we see athletes that are strong and use their voice as a collective that come together to change the system, and then other teams and other entities around the world go, they did it, we can do it. We're seeing that ripple effect of our women's national team and the power that they created for themselves in the system. I mean, we have a long way to go,
Yeah.
but it's starting. I was thinking it's like a flywheel, right? We're just like trying to get that first revolution, and then hopefully then it starts really moving to create wide systems.
Widespread change. Yeah, we've seen a lot of teams take note of what the U.S. women's national team has done and start to demand more. We've also seen the means by which it's done is sort of, it requires a multifaceted attack. It can't just be internal, because too often the top levels of brass are not interested. So it's using social media, it's using journalism, it's using creative protest. I think back to Stacey Allister, former WTA head, who talked about getting equal pay at Wimbledon and how she enlisted politicians to talk about it in England. She enlisted super powerful celebrities, social media outcomes, polls of the average person, like bringing all of these pieces of evidence together so that there's less power in the singular people at the top who are demanding that things remain the same and who are fighting for the status quo. So it feels like that coming together as a group and then pulling from all these different factors that can influence the public is really important. How do we change that media representation that we've been talking about around coaching, the narrative about what kind of coaching is best, and the media and the way they portray it?
I think just as we've seen some changes with how we portray female athletes as competent, badass, multidimensional, amazing women, we need to do that for coaches as well. Because when you change the narrative, you change the perception. And we're just not quite there yet with coaches. And we know, and you know, well, you've been part of the change, Sarah, is that how we portray female athletes matters. It's the same with women coaches. And so we have a long way to go. And the Women's World Cup is a great stage to really start doing that, especially with the number of women that are in the tournament.
Absolutely. How do we educate girls and women about their subconscious bias, about coaches, or about women in power?
I think it has to start young, because most coaches, especially in youth soccer at the youngest levels, are men. So that's the norm. You see men, you're coached by men, you've only had men, and then all of a sudden you have a woman. It's like, wait a minute. This, she's not competent. I want a male coach. I hear that all the time. And so just having those conversations, coaches can have it, athletic administrators, coaching directors, club directors can have those. It can be a 10-minute conversation with girls to say, here's what gender bias is. You have it. We all have it. I want you to be aware of it. And so it's just layering that as you get older into college. You know, it can be more sophisticated, but just calling it out for what it is. We do not do that at all. Right. It is across the board. Maybe this coach does it, that coach does it, but not
society-wide. Yeah. And I think a lot of times it's simply naming it that allows us to identify it and try to change it. I think about actually Angel City minority owner Glennon Doyle, her book Untamed. You're reading it, and there are so many instances within that book that you think, oh my gosh, I had no idea. I had internalized all of that and kept it in here, and it was reflecting in ways that I wasn't even conscious of. And so being able to name and identify those things that we have kind of been just taught by society and have been reinforced over and over throughout our lives, that we have to unlearn them in order to change behavior. That includes in the household as well as in sports programs and at schools. Let's talk about that.
One more thing about that, Sarah, in terms of when you do talk to female athletes about gender bias and say, look, most all of you are going to enter the workforce and you are going to be punched in the face with gender bias. So let's learn about this now so that when you are experiencing it yourself as a woman leader, you know to call it, name it, and how to deal with it. So that's been my experience with talking with female athletes about this. They're like, oh, I had no idea. And then when you bring them in to the system and, you know, peek behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz, oh, I see. That's how it's working. That they can be part of the change and not the problem.
Well, we certainly learned that last year during the 50th anniversary of Title IX. For all the celebration that we did around the law, we also uncovered that it was failing at extremely high levels at almost every institution in the country, despite it being a law, and that most athletes didn't even recognize the rights that they were being denied and that they would be required to fight and sue for them in order for them to be recognized despite the law being in place. And the same goes for so many other things, right? It's until you're actually told, this is actually wrong. This is not how it's supposed to be. You're just used to it because you've always been told it was okay. And you can fight back against it, that things actually start to change. I want to finally just close by talking about, I mentioned Glennon Doyle, and there are these incredible owners at the highest levels. Angel City really changed the dynamic across the NWSL by giving us a new model. As Abby Wambach said, if they won't give you a seat at the table, screw pulling up a chair, just build a new table. And that's what they did. And it influenced so many other teams, including the Red Stars, of which I'm a part. How does that matter more than just figureheads or ambassadors or, looks good? How important is it that we actually put more women into these leadership positions across teams, across leagues, across things like FIFA, if we actually want to see structural change?
It's very necessary, because when you bring women to the table, they bring their experiences, they bring their perceptions, and they see things differently. Not all women see things the same, but when you have a diversity of women at the table, and it's women-led, it's for women, by women, it just changes the system dramatically. Right. Now, these women at the top also have to the women at the top also have to be aware of their own gender bias. So sometimes when women rise to power, they've adopted the male model, and they're our own worst enemy. So I'm not saying Angel City has done that. I think they've done it right, where you have the right women around the table for the right reasons. That's when systems change happens. And that needs to happen at every team, every level, every federation, and for sure at FIFA.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we've been told so often that there's only room for one, and we've often been told that we will pit each other against each other. Even when that doesn't happen, that's still the narrative that we're sold, that women will fight each other over things. And sometimes it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're told that enough times, then you'll get to a certain space, be glad to be the token one, and keep others out instead of reaching down and lifting up as you get to rise, which of course is what we know needs to happen, and that there are plenty of seats at the table and should be more for all of us, and that it's part of the job of women who succeed to bring others along with them. I have to say, in the spaces that I've been in that have been predominantly women, I find that the work gets done, it's efficient, best idea wins, supportive, collaborative, certainly combative at times when people disagree, but then you move forward, and there's a lot less time measuring pencils, as we say, and fighting over who gets to be the one in charge and the dominant voice instead of focusing on the end goal of what we want to accomplish. So I encourage and hope for more spaces like that going forward. Nicole,
and if that model that you just described, like the women-led, women-driven, women-focused leadership model, if that becomes the norm, I'll be a happy woman.
Would it that is not because too many when the whole Supreme Court is all women. That's what it's been with men. So why stop, right?
That's right. Because we've had the other model, and clearly that has not worked for women, and I would also say for everyone. So let's try something different.
I would have to agree. Always learn from you. Always love talking to you. Sarah Spain, Dr. Nicole LaVoi from the Tucker Center for Research in Girls and Women in Sport, here for Angel City Equity House and for Gatorade. Let's keep these conversations going.